So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Britain is breaking down and the Tories risk irrelevancy. This is another article from Jeremy Warner where he's very critical of the Tories. I've read quite a few of these where, despite him being a Telegraph writer, he's very critical of them. Provision of affordable and reliable public services is one of the hallmarks of an advanced economy. When these things break down, the difference between us and the developing and third world becomes less easy to define. Now, you wouldn't really say the developing world and then the third world. You could use a phrase like the global south, for example, or you just use developing world. You wouldn't make a third distinction. Yet breakdown they certainly have. The airports don't work, health services failing, water companies are unable to guarantee supply, they're also dumping raw sewage into the waterways, and energy bills are going through the roof. The basics of what you'd see as a developed economy, I think, where people can afford the basics to live if they have, a full-time job, is completely being destroyed. He says the government fiddles while Rome burns, which is absolutely true. As things stand, the ruling Conservative Party is staring an almost certain defeat at the next election in the face. There is only so long the supposed triumph of getting Brexit done can sustain things, and the voters are fast forgetting its warm glow. And let's not forget that, just because the Tories will keep arguing, we got Brexit done, is that people are going to say, and then what? That was 5 years ago. If it's 2024, it was 4 years ago. You got Brexit done. What have you done with it? That's going to be the key question I think Labour should ask. And so should the Lib Dems. All the parties should ask it. Yeah, you got Brexit done, and then what? What did you do after that? Nothing. Market forces are meanwhile about to render millions of households almost quite literally destitute. I wouldn't say it's market forces. I would say it's more corporate greed and price gouging. Yet here we are quarrelling over whether to reverse a 1.25 percentage point increase in national insurance, or who can deregulate food standards most. I mean, the problem is they're talking, when it comes to national insurance increases or cuts, they're talking small potatoes here, given that energy, just the cost of energy for households is going to go up double. And the problem with that is businesses are going to face even more costs because their energy rates are uncapped. So a lot of small and medium businesses are going to go under, potentially going to cut down or reduce, their output. And of course, prices are going to go up for food and other things because shops are going to get hit with massive price bills where they're going to increase their costs. There's already stories about corner shops facing absolute mayhem with the energy costs. And if those close down, people who live in, who don't have access to a car, for example, will suffer massively because they'd be the ones typically the most reliant on corner shops. A new man or woman in number 10 isn't in itself going to make a great deal of difference to the current sense of failure. It's going to give the Tories a bump in the polls because whoever comes in, Sunak or Truss, will be given time, but after a few months, once that energy bill kicks in, I think that any goodwill is going to be dead. Is this all we have to show for a government of 12 years standing? Which is true, that despite the fact that we've had different prime ministers, we've had Cameron, May, Johnson, and then Truss or Sunak, they've been in charge for 12 years now. What are their achievements? Inflation is heading for 13%, a looming recession. This will be a longer-term recession than the '08 one, and a public service infrastructure seemingly incapable of meeting the basic standards of supply. About the only thing the new occupants of Downing Street will have going for them is the even more hopeless state of the opposition. Now, I would say that the opposition are not more hopeless than the Tory party. I think that Keir Starmer isn't the best person. I think the Labour Party aren't that great in terms of a lot of the things that they do, but I think they seem a lot more competent than the Tories do. At least the polls bear that out as well. Up goes the cry. The world has changed and the supposed free market solutions of the past no longer work. Renationalise it and be done with it. The problem is you have to renationalise the energy generators, the ones who produce the energy, rather than the suppliers. The suppliers in this case aren't the problem. It's the people who generate the energy. And, what's his name? Starmer's not talking about renationalising anyway, so this whole argument he makes is a huge straw man. Yet you only need to look at the disaster of the National Health Service. The argument that the NHS is doing badly because it's under public ownership is wrong. It's been chronically underfunded for 12 years now. We've had massive problems with it. Brexit has caused issues with the NHS, as well as visas and other things. And the fact that they've got rid of the nurses' bursary, nurses' pay is shoddy, very low. Doctors, or a lot of the people who work in the NHS, even the top earners, I think they feel like they're not paid what they deserve, and it's probably the case. The failings in health provision might reasonably be seen as even worse than those of the privately owned energy and water companies. They've done far worse. The energy companies and the water companies have done far worse, despite the fact that they're still making profits. Obviously, the NHS can't make a profit, but it's been chronically underfunded. Water companies and energy companies can't claim they're underfunded. They make enough money. The narrative is already well established and gaining traction by the day that the public has been fleeced by private investors, which is true. We have. The last Labour government must bear a fair amount of blame for allowing the culture of supposed just-in-time capital and operational efficiency to take hold. That genuinely is such a weird criticism. What's wrong with just-in-time capital and operational efficiency? Those sound like good things. But Labour has been out of power for a long time now, 12 years, I checked. There is no quarrelling with where this way of thinking originally came from. The Conservative-led government of the 80s and 90s, the current lot are unavoidably tarred with its assumed failures. I don't think that's the case. I mean, a lot of time has passed since the 80s and 90s. I know older people don't understand how time works because they think the 90s was the other day, but the 80s and 90s happened a long time ago. The right says, I'm old enough to have been involved in covering all four of the big utility privatisations: telecom, gas, water and electricity. For my sins, I was not once named Water Journalist of the Year, which is hilarious. But the fact is, I think a lot of the people growing up now in kind of their 20s or maybe 30s always thought that the telecoms, gas, water and electricity were always privatised, that they weren't ever under government control at any point. Firstly, that it would be insane to privatise the industry with its prior regulatory responsibilities left intact. Again, is he saying that we need more regulations? Is he saying we need to be more kind of left on this issue? Finally, that in order to persuade the city to buy in, the government would be investing the companies with massive green dowries, city investors duly cleaned up. So what you have is a system where the government put up massive incentives for city investors to invest in water companies and other key utilities with subsidies. Essentially, green dowries he's talking about there. It's more socialism. So the only reason they invested in was because more socialism and the fact that they're guaranteed returns. Memories are short and it is easy to forget what decades of public ownership has done to these industries. And yet we know what private industries has done to these companies. It's nothing good. Water quality failed just about every EU directive going. And, I guess that's the only benefit of Brexit. We're not subject to EU directives anymore. That's it. Privatisation was driven by an entirely understandable desire to protect the taxpayer by getting these utilities off the public balance sheet. The problem is these private companies are not investing in these utilities. We're still reliant on Victorian era pipes, and storm drains and other things. Surely these private companies should have sorted these out now. They're not going to. And instead making the private sector responsible for addressing decades of underinvestment. I've got news for you, Chief. They're not going to invest in these waterways properly. They're not going to solve the problems that we're facing now, particularly in sectors such as water, where there can be no competition and services instead provided by regional monopolies. So if you're a regional monopoly, what incentive do you have to fix any of the pipework? You have a monopoly. No one can touch you. The idea that they're going to fix anything is ridiculous, especially with CEOs of these companies making huge amounts of money. The government is ordering a review of the National Grid sale of its gas transmission business to Macquarie Asset Management and British Columbia Investment Management Corporation. And the question is, why would they want to buy this stuff from the National Grid unless they see these aspects of the National Grid as money spinners, profit machines? That's the reason they would want to invest in them. As a publicly listed company, National Grid has behaved relatively responsibly in carrying out its duties. The point being is that there is nothing wrong with privately managed and owned public services as such. In my opinion, if they're making a profit, that's money the taxpayer could save. But in a crisis, it has been found wanting. It is going to require much larger interventions by the government than anything seen to date to prevent the current escalation in bills spiralling into civil unrest. The problem is, these companies are making record profits. Centrica, BP, Shell, and nothing. They have no reason to not price gouge the public. The job of the CEO at the end of the day is to maximize returns for shareholders. That's what keeps them in a job. So if they increase the price of energy by however much they want to, if no one's going to stop them, why wouldn't they do it? At the end of the day, the government isn't putting any price caps or anything in the way of these companies to do so. The Ofgem, the energy regulator, seems happy to play ball with these companies and happy to allow them to make maximum money. Because at the end of the day, it's not the energy suppliers that are the problem, it's the providers, it's the generators, the ones that generate the electricity, the ones that own the wind farms, etc. They're the ones that are the problem here. In the longer term, sky-high gas prices will only come down once the market starts to believe that Europe can survive without Russian supplies. I mean, once the supply issue is solved, that's when the energy price will come down. The problem is I don't know when that's going to happen. Because at the moment, what's happening is EU countries are looking at ways of cutting themselves off from Russian gas. If that means moving to renewables, they're going to do their best to fast track that as much as possible. And so once that happens, gas prices will come down naturally. There'll be less demand for it, and therefore the price of the supply will come down. But the issue is that the UK government is not looking at moving more towards renewables, and that's a key problem because we'll still be, dependent on gas that's typically imported, especially when we don't have the storage for it, and we are very vulnerable to global price shocks, which will impact people very negatively. Not everything in this article is perfect, but for a Telegraph writer to be this critical of the government is kind of crazy, because this government is pushing itself towards irrelevancy. The government have to step in and do something, because we're looking at potentially a winter of discontent levels of unrest, where you've got just people on strike constantly, nothing happening in this country, nothing moving, bins not being collected, etc. And that's very damaging for the government of the day. If the basics of a country cannot run, it shows you that we are moving towards living in a failed state in a sense, especially for a developed economy. That is not a good look. And you've got massive strikes in railways. Some of the bus companies, I think in London predominantly, are on strike. You have a lack of staff at airports, a lack of staff at ports in general. I mean, the staff at Felix are going on strike, which means that getting in goods is going to be a lot more problematic. Most of that is container goods. It would be toys and other things that you buy in the shops, books potentially, those sorts of goods that we import. It's just going to be constant knock-on effects, and this government is just not wanting to deal with anything that we're facing currently. I think the energy bills will be the major problem the government will face, but the opposition and the media need to talk about how other countries are helping out citizens in their country. Not every country can do what France has done, but they can do a hell of a lot more than what they've done currently. Other countries are looking at more direct financial support. I think Ireland and Portugal are doing quite well in that regard. Who cares if debt to GDP goes up? Because what you're going to have is a country that's failed. People can't pay for energy. You're going to have people's credit scores ruined when it's not their fault. You're going to have people die effectively because of what this government is doing. And at the end of the day, the government does have a role when it comes to interventions in the state, and the Tories can neglect that as much as they want, but unless the opposition parties start talking about how they will solve these problems, the public may not blame the right people. And at the end of the day, the public need to blame the energy generators and also the government of the day. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.